Okay, guys. Sorry for delay lecture, but things have changed dramatically here. I think I told you this before, but France has been easing the lockdown, and as you can see, more and more people on the streets. Some of us with masks. Here's mine, and the reason why I don't have it in my mouth is because you're not required, and really it's okay not to have it when you're walking in the street, as long as you keep social distancing. But then when you go into any store, uh, you need to wear it. Anyway, this last week, the lecture that we have today is about, and it's around the concept of language and communication, and how do I apply that to intercultural communication. Well, turns out it's at the core of our discipline and our subject. I think that I ask you, because I asked to all my classes, like the last thing that we do is to define culture, but certainly something that you already know because of the previous chapters and presentations and lectures that we have had. Language is one of the features that definitely both shape but also are the result of culture. So at least, even though we are not going to define it immediately, but definitely language is key. By the way, this is like the heart of downtown, and you can see there's so much going on compared to just a week ago. We have been opening for about a week, and it's interesting. The schools are open only twice a week in small groups. Well, going back to this language, which I posted, I'm trying to remember, the last article that I gave you was actually a video, and it was La Légion Française, which most of you, according to your comments, you didn't know that existed. And those who know me, had classes with me, will not surprised to know this. But first of all, I was a ranger, so I was in a special forces unit. But before that, when I was 17, I actually sent a letter to the Foreign Legion from Chile, by the way, and they wrote me back saying that I could, but I need to move to Paris and then walk into the place. And anyway, now I have friends who are actually a legionnaire. And as many of you notice, language is key. So they accept anybody, right, from anywhere in the world. There's 130 different nationalities on any given day in the Legion. And but even though they don't obviously demand for any candidate to speak French, through the process after an enlistment, you need to learn the language and you need to speak French, which is kind of like what brings you together. It's not the only one thing, but obviously, otherwise it wouldn't be possible to communicate. Where are we going? Oh yeah, I need to get something. You coming with me to do some shopping. Those guys over there, that's my Frank, this is my Barbier, and those guys decided as soon as the quarantine was over, I just got my hair. How do you like it? They dress like the characters from one Spanish series in Netflix. You have seen it probably. I don't know how they translate it in English, but it's called, they wear those funny masks. They look like Dali. Anyway, those guys dress up like that, including the mask, the first day after the confinement and, well, the total confinement. There's still a little bit of that. Anyway, language. So yeah, of course, one of the, obviously the first thing is like when you don't speak somebody else's language. I speak several languages, so I go around, and even in my household, and this is not just to show off, it's the reality, so it's just my reality, but we speak 3-4 different languages at home regularly every day. And it depends where we are, right? States or here in Latin America, it changes, but so the first barrier, the obvious barrier is the language itself, like what language you speak. If you can understand it, that's one thing, and you can understand the structure of the language and the terms and the vocabulary, but there's then different levels, of course, right? Les fonctions du langage, different functions of language, and there's some that are less obvious and they're more intrinsically related to the cultural aspect of language. And again, language and culture are just the same thing to some extent. Not exactly the same thing, but they overlap quite a lot. What happens is that, languages are different in many, many different ways. Some of them they have, for instance, I'm going to give you a good example. Hopefully this will help. The whole discussion about genderize or degenderize language is a very interesting one. I want to throw a question at you, and maybe some of you have an answer. So if we start using terms like, well, in Spanish is todos, todas, everybody, masculine or feminine, and they are pushing for todes, right? And in English, I guess, you know really well, we're trying to, use pronouns, but also kind of like take to neutralize and gender-wise neutralize the gender within language. And interesting enough, English actually lacks, for the most part, the explicit markers of gender, but within the language, of course, there's gender. Yes, sir. No, ma'am. Right? That's how we determine language, with the same, or yes, ma'am, yes, sir. But there's other languages like Spanish, for instance, where or German. In the case of German, there's three genders, including neutral. In Spanish and in French as well, and the Latin languages, for the most part, that's actually the case. Now, of course, this is an exercise, so do you have the answer? How many languages lack gender? And are those languages actually within societies and cultures that, I guess, since that's the claim, the implicit claim that languages that lack gender should create a more inclusive environment, gender-wise. Well, is that the case? Well, you don't have to go too far. There's a lot of languages today that lack gender, almost entirely. Which languages are those, and which societies are those? And is there a relationship between those two? Is there a correlation? Certainly we cannot establish causation, but is there a correlation? Meaning, like, languages that are more inclusive are also part of more inclusive societies and cultures? Or you want the short answer? No. And I'm going to give you that. I'm going to leave you that as a homework. Find out what languages today lack this gender neutral, I guess, and let's see if they correlate with more inclusive, gender inclusive societies. Now I gotta go into the supermarket. When I come out, we continue the conversation. Enjoy the view. And not me, I'm talking about. So, where were you? Oh, wait, where were I? Where was I? Sorry. You know, I'm practicing my English, but at home mostly, and with some friends, but for the most part, it's French nowadays. So, language, right? Again, we're talking about this thing in the paper that last week's group presented. Stated clearly, languages is like one of the factors that plays the biggest role when it comes to individuals from different cultures confronting each other. And languages say a lot about, again, culture and many things. But the interesting, as always, paradoxical thing is that not necessarily in an obvious way, and it couldn't be any differently, because remember, there's always a perspective. So even though, like in my case, I speak different languages, but those languages are one thing, and they are some sort of like a window, or a door rather, into a culture, into individuals, into society, into values. The most obvious ones, but remember, it's not always clear, or sometimes it's even counterintuitive, if you want, but things like saving time, like the way we use, the way we refer, I guess, to certain things in English, arguably could be, when I talk to monolingual individuals, most of you, I'm assuming, some of you anyway, it's not an insult, by the way, we all start like that, well, no, actually, but anyway, they say interesting things such as, French have so many different ways to say things, but guess what? It's exactly what people that speak English, and only English is what they tell me, or Spanish, and we all believe that, our languages, I guess, I don't know if you all believe, but, we will think that languages definitely are functional to certain historical moments, and again, landscape and so on. So an interesting way to see the limits of this is actually technology, and even power, of course, translates into English. But keep in mind, there's some different things. Like if you think, for instance, in a language like Spanish, I'm thinking Spanish or French, or German, and English, I guess. So I like to use the papillon or butterflies, mirlich, mariposa, right? So papillon, which is butterfly in French, is masculine, and butterfly technically doesn't have any gender. If I push you, you come out with one gender. In the case of Spanish, it's feminine. So you have, mirlich is also masculine. So you have feminine, masculine, neutral, masculine. Tricky, right? So what is a butterfly in an essential way? I was just making a previous lecture for my identity class, and we're talking about feminism and womanhood and essentialism, right? Oops, it's close. What I came here for is close. Anyway, it's tricky. I mean, a butterfly is a butterfly, right? But it's also a papillon and so on. So anyway, you may think that means something. In some cases it does, in some other cases it's just simply a function, or rather a result of certain inner structures of the language itself. It's not reflecting any particular alliance to certain ideological beliefs, like a more sexist or racist language. However, language allows us to, again, through this window and door that constitute language, we can definitely see certain things and look into into the peoples, right, that share that particular language. It's quite interesting. I'm thinking about my experience in Switzerland, which is Switzerland is probably the country in Europe that I know the best after France, I guess. And you go from valley to valley. It's a very small country, and everybody knows it's very beautiful. Although the ideas they have about Switzerland is a part of Switzerland. It's not all of it, but anyway, it's beautiful. And in the German part, for instance, they speak dialects pretty much in valleys. We're talking about a couple kilometers distance. You go from Zurich to the next valley, and then they already change, and they don't like each other. It's a very interesting story, but it's the same here. Like the way we pronounce in the south of France, pain, du pain. It's very different than the way the Parisiens they do, right? So why? Well, different things. It has to do with influx, migrations, and so on, right? The influences. There's a lot of Maghrébins. There's a lot of people from northern Africa that lives here in the south. Historically, actually, you can still literally walk in the roads made by the Romans when they were moving into Hispania, which is today Spain. So, there's layers of that, and English is, comes from England, yes, but also English is a mix of different languages and dialects, and evolves. Language, just like culture, is always moving in different directions. And by the way, going back to what I was just saying earlier, this latest, not unique push for gender inclusiveness and so on, which I'm not criticizing, of course, not the gender inclusiveness, which I'm calling your attention on is basically looking at, like, what are the correct and misguided, sometimes misinformed ideas that we have around this, that language itself can take care of gender inequalities, or it can even contribute to it. I'm sure, of course it does, but yeah, I'm more of a structuralist in that sense, I guess you know that. So I think that there's some political push for increasing, equality and so on. But anyway, so it's an interesting, thing to ponder about. What else can we say about this language thing? Going back to other things too, like touching into something that's very important that we have touched again and again, because obviously this is an accumulation, and we were building on previous lectures and concepts. The idea of low context and high context that we touch repeatedly, because I like a lot the Hall's concepts. Is the tram, and somebody goes. Anyway, right. It's so complicated, because at the end of the day, you need to put all these different layers together in order to define culture, and language nowadays always being fluid, by the way. Now I remember something I left in top of my mind a few minutes ago, this idea of technology. I was talking about the ages of language and how language changes. So there's a concept for that. It's called lingua franca, which is like, what is the language that influential power, centers of power, national power, linguistic powers expand to other places, right? So at some point, French was the lingua franca, and actually you can look into that by seeing institutions, especially international and diplomatic institutions, they still maintain French as one of the primary languages, and is associated, particularly in the States, with high class and so on. And there's reasons for that, probably, which, let's talk about it. When you look at Jackie Kennedy, right? She spoke very good French, and she actually, French people loved her when she came, and de Gaulle, fell in love with her because she spoke French. And it's just, what is the? I love French, of course, right? But if you speak French in the States, it gives you some allure, but in practical terms, I will be hard pressed to come out with some very good reason for the Spanish. On the other hand, is very practical, but language, just like any other aspect of society and culture, they have hierarchies, and those hierarchies are related to power. They speak and they represent and reflect power. So that means that when, you may like this or not, but here in France as well, speaking French, which is different too, because France and French is a very particular thing. Go back to in a minute. That's the last thing for the lecture today, but let's go back to the other thing. If I asked you to make a list of different languages, German, Spanish, Latin, Chinese, Japanese, and so on, you should be able to put them in a certain order, in a hierarchical order, just like anything else. And that order, if we define it as such, is like, well, tell me what are the languages with the most prestige or the most useful. Well, then we can make those distinctions. And they, of course, are related to certain positions like the position of certain societies and cultures within the world order, and it has always been the case. So, when Rome was Rome, I'm not talking about Christian Rome, I'm talking about, my people, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, my great-grandfather came from Italy, but I'm saying, I'm Latino, so I do have Romanic ancestors, among other things. Those guys, Latin was the language, right? And at some point was Spanish, and at some point, right now, it's English, but also was English before, and French, and Turkish in certain areas, and Chinese, and Japanese, and so on. Right, that changes, but there's always a lingua franca, and you can always place language in a certain structure, in a certain order, in a certain hierarchy related to the position of those peoples that speak those languages, And now technology, well, belongs to those that are creating it, which in this case is particularly Anglo-Saxon countries and the States, and English, of course, is the lingua franca. You speak English, well, you're good, I guess. So I guess that you guys are covered. Yeah, and I wanted to say last thing. Right, so a last thought. There's very few monolingual societies. Actually, the States is one of them. There's a reason, there's many reasons for them. There's historical reasons, political reasons, but also geographical. You can place the United States in a map and you will see that, to some extent, even though it's in the Americas, of course, you're between the Atlantic and the Pacific, and up north, and we are isolated from where used to be the center of the world, at least for the last few centuries. And this is, take it with a grain of salt, because the world for us, right, the Western world, but it was Europe until the Second World War. And after that, the axe of power moved to the United States. For the most part, here in Europe is the best example. But also in Latin America, Spanish in Latin America is, of course, the main language, and in some cases even the official language. But there's a lot of other indigenous languages spoken, in some cases actually dramatically so, like in the case of Bolivia, which I've been to Bolivia several times. Mexico, I just was there for over a month last year with my kids. I went to school, and yeah, you go to certain regions in Chiapas and so on, and you will find different dialects spoken by, in an important way. You can commerce and teach in those languages. And France, actually, in that sense, and this is the last part, is actually an exception, because, through centuries, Richelieu and Napoleon and the Revolution and so on, the French, until this day, they protect their language officially. And in cinemas, for instance, you do have one or two shows every day where the movie, that if it's a foreign movie, they will show the movie in the original language. They call that version originale subtitrée, which means like the original version with subtitles. But the movies are actually dubbed. And why? Because they call that l'exception française, and they try to protect the language. So they want people to keep speaking French and to actually expand even the reach of the French language abroad. When I was in Chile, I studied l'Alliance Française, which is an French international school, where I learned French, when I went to preschool over there. Then I forgot about it, and then I relearned it, I guess. That's how it goes. Anyway, most of Europe, they speak, several languages. Last year? I don't know. No, 2 years ago, we were, camping around Europe with my kids and my wife, and we went to Italy, France, Mont Blanc, we did Germany, Switzerland, and so on. And when we went to the north part of northern Italy, which is actually also southern Austria, and it used to be southern Austria and not northern Italy, but then they go back and forward, wars and wars and invasions and leaving. They speak German there in Seiser Alm. I was in Seiser Alm, which is like right there. Actually, that's basically where alpinism was born. And you have the Dolomites, beautiful place. But yeah, I mean, they spoke to me in Italian because I'm brown, and my wife was a blonde, and they spoke to her in German. I mean, we were waiting. I would be behind her. We go into store to buy something, and we're in Italy. Keep that in mind. Officially, everybody speaks German, and with an Austrian accent. Well, actually, no, with an Alpine accent, I guess. Anyway, and they spoke to her in German and to me in Italian. Bene. Anyway, most of Europe, except for this country of mine here in France, they speak more than one language. Great Britain, English, Welsh, Scottish, that qualifies a language. Italy, same thing. Germany, to some extent, different landers, they have very different accents too. Well, anyway, enough. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you soon. I leave you with that, view of the tram leaving. I'm going to keep searching for those interviews to post. It just takes a lot of work. And also, next time I take my kids to school, which is only twice a week, I will try to sneak in and I can show you how that works. Have a good day, guys. Arrivederci, addio, auf Wiedersehen, ciao, au revoir.